Mr. Tallarico, for what purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for a couple of questions?
As the
Absolutely.
gentleman yields for questions.
Thank you, Representative Shatzline. I'm just trying to figure out exactly what your amendment does. So you are striking in the bill the exception for a child to be able to consent to counseling. Is that what am I understanding that correctly?
So what this amendment would do is essentially it's ensuring that children can't be socially transitioned without a parent even knowing that this is happening. And so what this amendment touches on is emotional abuse. So what we did was we made sure that abuse can still be reported. We made sure that if neglect is happening, physical abuse, sexual abuse, that these counselors can still have access to be able to help those children. However, emotional abuse is subjective. It's something that we can't really define. It's one of those things that this could open up an entire slew of topics that we could talk to kids about that should have parental consent if we're going to talk about them.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was opening it up for children to get counseling about sexuality. I'm not seeing that in the part of code that you're removing. If I'm looking at the consent to counseling section of code, it's a child may consent to counseling for suicide prevention, chemical addiction or dependency, or sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Is that what you're...
Yeah, and what we struck in there was the part that talks about emotional abuse. That's what we're hitting on, because here's our idea. And really what we're touching on is emotional abuse, because it cannot truly be defined. What we're looking at is a situation where if emotional abuse is said to be being done, whether we agree with it, whether I agree with it, or you agree with it, it opens up the counselor's ability to talk about anything without consent. And so that's the idea, is that if emotional abuse is in there, is that it removes the parental consent requirement in order for that counselor to talk with the student about subjects.
But it's not opening the counselor up to talk about anything. It's just these three things that are in statute: the suicide prevention, chemical addiction, or sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. Is that
right?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
I'll give you a scenario. So if a student comes in and says, "Dad says I throw like a girl," right? And all of a sudden they say, "Well, that's emotional abuse." And when that happens, all of a sudden it's looked at as I get to open up the door and say, "Well, I can talk to you without parental consent right now about different topics because you have just disclosed something to me that allows me to skip the parental permission within this."
And so you are leaving in the reporting requirement. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's why we put affect the duty to report child abuse or neglect under Chapter 261 Family Code, or an investigation of a report of abuse or neglect under this chapter, or under that chapter, excuse me, because we want to make sure that if there is legitimate abuse going on, that this counselor has the ability to intervene, has the ability to step in and say, "Hey, let's get you some help, let's report this," so that we can make sure that that student is safe.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is if 2 is about affecting a child's consent to counseling about these things, Section 3 is about reporting if there is abuse. How will the counselor know there's abuse possibly happening if the child is not able to consent to that counseling to begin with under Section 2?
Well, remember, what we're looking at is when we talk about the different types of abuse, we're not changing the family code. So that's still protected. Like, counselors can still talk about well-being. And if a child opens up and says, "I'm being physically abused at home, I'm being sexually abused in this situation or scenario," this immediately allows that counselor to intervene. What we don't want is when emotional abuse is talked about, when all of a sudden it's like, well, all walls go down, and now that counselor gets to talk about anything they want with this student. And so that's the goal of this amendment, is to make sure that counselors can do their job and still intervene in emergency situations, but they're not undermining parents with ideologies that those parents didn't consent to.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, if we adopt your amendment, a counselor would need to get parental consent to talk to a child about possible abuse at home?
No, because we're not amending the family code. Those counselors already have that ability. What we're saying is this is not going to open up a door where it says a simple, my father or my mother said this to me. And we label that as emotional abuse. So now these counselors can waive any ability to have to reach out to that parent and say, hey, what's going on here? There's supposedly emotional abuse here, or you said this. They wouldn't have to do that. They can just dig in and begin to say whatever they would like to that child.
Well, let's just set aside the emotional abuse for a second, because this too is inclusive of all kinds of abuse. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's why we put right here in this line to affect the duty to report child abuse or neglect.
No, I know.
Under Chapter 261, Family Code, or an investigation of a report of abuse or neglect under the chapter.
So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how a counselor will be able to figure out if they need to.
It's super simple. So I worked in public schools as well. I know you did too. It starts as a conversation, as you know. When a student walks in, whether it's a classroom or whether it's with a counselor, and we say, hey, how's your day going? What's going on at home? The moment that a student alludes to sexual abuse, physical abuse, you see bruising, you see anything that presents itself, that's a moment where you need to report. But when we look at this emotional abuse, that's so broad. I mean, when we talk about emotional abuse, it's difficult to even define. It's difficult to walk through on because at the end of the day, it's going to be defined by that counselor. And I'm sorry, but I don't really trust that a counselor is going to be able to make the decision to be able to say, you know what, that constitutes me going above the head of the parent. That constitutes me undermining the ability to get permission from a parent to be able to have a conversation with this student. And look, at the end of the day, if we're really about parental rights, we want to make sure that if a situation arises where a counselor or a teacher or someone in the school disagrees with one little thing or ideology that we may be taking at home. Let's say that counselor has a different religion. Let's say that counselor doesn't like that in our house we follow the 10 Commandments. That's the moment where all of a sudden a counselor gets to say, are you being emotionally abused by 10 Commandments to be talked about inside your living room? That's the moment where, we don't want to give that power to that counselor without parental consent.
If your concern is about the emotional abuse part of this, why is that not just carved out? I'm worried that we're taking out the physical, sexual abuse, chemical addiction, dependency, suicide prevention.
Here's the best part. We're not, because we're not changing the family code, which is why we reference it. So when we say verbally asking the child about the child's general well-being or affect the duty to report child abuse or neglect under Chapter 261 Family Code or an investigation of a report of abuse or neglect under that chapter. That's actually why we added that in, because at the end of the day, you're right. We want to be able to ensure the protection and the safety of that child if they are being physically abused, if they are being sexually abused, but we don't really want the discretion of a counselor to say, oh, you're being taught about this concept that I might disagree with. That sounds like emotional abuse to me, because that opens the door for ideologies to be pushed on our kids without parental consent, and I just don't think that's right.
Well, I'm worried that we're just leaving out a big area in the middle, right? You're leaving in simple, quick checks for how a kid's doing, when they walk into the school.
Well, that's great. That's great. I'm glad you said that, because that's why we also said verbally asking the child about the child's general well-being. It opens the door.
No, I'm saying that's in there. That's great. And then you've also got reports when we know there's abuse happening. I'm trying to figure out, there's a big gulf between those two things.
That gulf you're talking about is the concept of a counselor having the discretion to undermine parents, and that's why we removed it. That big gap is us saying, hey, we're going to be super pointed.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And we're going to make sure that parents aren't undermined. Thank you.
Mr. Shatzline sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. However, a record vote is required. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Leach voting aye. Show Mr. Shatzline voting aye. Show Mr. Toth voting aye. Show Mr. Anchia voting no. Show Mr. Tinderholt voting aye. Show Ms. Gervin Hawkins voting no. Have all members voted? Show Mr. Dutton voting no. Have all members voted? There being 85 ayes and 50 nays, the amendment is adopted.